Welcome to TEDxShar now.
In a world where environmental crises are global headlines, there is one country's story that remains unheard. Yes, I'm talking about Afghanistan's future amid uncertainty and its battle with climate change and environmental problems. Before I go deep into the topic, I would like to talk about my journey as an environmental activist in Afghanistan. Well, my journey of environmental activism started taking shape back in 2016 when I started my Bachelor's of Environmental Sciences at Kabul University. Back then, the awareness about environment and climate change issues was so catastrophically low that I was often hearing very disheartening sentences from my friends, connections, and the society in general. Some of those sentences included phrases like, "Why are you studying environmental science? Do you want to end up becoming a municipality cleaner in the end? There is no future in this field, nor can you build one for Afghanistan." Those were the phrases that I often used to hear, and they are a sad reality and depiction of how low the environmental awareness was back then in Afghanistan. So, in short, my journey of environmental activism started at a point where many were mocking my environmental science studies journey as they did not understand the importance and value of the work I was doing and the grim future that awaited Afghanistan. Luckily, back then, I was following industry trends and activists in the global north, seeing that the activists in the developed countries were already taking to streets and advocating for their future with the climate crisis. I often felt alone and desperate about myself and Afghanistan. I wanted to do something about this. I wanted to start from somewhere. So I started mobilizing a group of environmental students to advocate for environmental protection through cleanup campaigns, TV interviews to raise awareness, paintings and environmental art shows on the streets and walls of Kabul, air pollution campaigns, green dialogues and conferences, and much more. In the process of doing so, I faced a very huge barrier. This barrier was lack of environmental content and outreach materials that we could use in our activities. I had the urge to do something about this. So I started working on a book while at the same time continuing my activism with national and international organizations. Fortunately, it was 2018 that I finally published my first book of its kind in Afghanistan. The book entitled Farhanga Hifazat az Muhit Zist, which translates into Environment Protection Culture, which was published in Dari language in Kabul, Afghanistan. It was a cultural book filled with messages and content to be used in environmental education and outreach activities and to motivate the citizens to care for the environment. However, lack of environmental outreach materials was not the only challenge I was facing. In fact, I was advocating for environmental protection and climate action in a country that had been in war and conflict for over 4 decades. The urgency and emergency of wars often impede us from thinking and reflecting about the long-term impacts of wars on the environment and the society in general. Which might bring you to a question. How have the recent wars impacted Afghanistan environment? And what changes have they caused? Well, it's a very complex question, but I would try to address it in some way. Wars have left many long-term impacts as a dark legacy on the natural environment of Afghanistan. The environment is not only a silent victim of armed conflict, but unfortunately it is an often overlooked and frequently ignored phenomena. Sadly, the damage caused by wars has had implications for the people of Afghanistan as well as for its ecosystem and biodiversity. Unfortunately, what is even scary is that these effects are then compounded with the climate crisis, which is catastrophic and there is a long road to recovery. And yet, despite the long road to recovery for Afghanistan's natural environment, it is a country that is forgotten and is not given the voice in global climate negotiations. Nowadays, everybody talks about other crises Afghanistan is facing. But for me, the climate change impacts are the catalysts to all other crises. That is why I believe it is crucial now more than ever that Afghanistan's voice should not be silenced. Despite the fact that Afghanistan is among the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change and ranks 4th in the Informed Risk Index of 2023, it is not receiving the attention and support it requires. While today we talk about loss and damage finance in global climate conferences, negotiations, and discussions, after the catastrophic political developments of August 2021, all climate change and environmental projects were halted in Afghanistan. And since then, Afghanistan has been deprived of all climate negotiations, including the COP26 in Glasgow, UK, the COP27 in Egypt, and the COP28 in UAE. There was no one to speak up for Afghanistan and bring up Afghanistan's climate crisis to the attention of world leaders, international organizations, and the global north countries, who are the main culprits of the very climate crisis that the global south countries like Afghanistan are facing. Unfortunately, the voice of over 34 million people, most affected by the climate crisis, will likely be silenced once again in this year's COP29 in Baku. Now, you might have yet another question in your mind. You might ask how I feel as an activist from the Global South, given the current reality of the climate crisis. Well, to express it in short, as an activist from the Global South, I often feel disappointed and frustrated that my country has been betrayed. Afghanistan is one of the hardest hit countries, despite contributing so little to climate change. It has already experienced almost all effects of climate change. In the past 3 years alone, we had devastating flash floods in different provinces. We had snow in the middle of summer, and we had wildfires in several provinces. Not to mention the recent flash floods that occurred in several provinces in just a week ago from this event. One might think that once the Taliban took power, people would have more urgent concerns. But for me, the climate crisis is the mother of all crises. I believe as a catalyst, the climate change fuels humanitarian crises in Afghanistan and in the region as well. And it makes every aspect of an Afghan's life worse. Another question that I believe many people might have in their mind is what climate change means for Afghanistan. Well, unfortunately again, there is a very harsh difference regarding what climate change means for Afghanistan or the global south countries. While the Western nations talk about circular economy, green economy, and carbon neutral objectives, all those concepts will sound stupid and absurd for Afghanistan if it is still struggling with humanitarian crises which are fueled by the climate crisis. While for the global north countries, the climate crisis might be a threat to their livelihoods, economic growth, and infrastructural expansion, for the global south countries like Afghanistan, it means so much more. It means losing the main source of the livelihood, which is the agricultural productivity and livestock in Afghanistan. The climate crisis for Afghanistan means malnutrition for the already insecure population and dying infants and mothers. It means public health emergencies for a country where the healthcare infrastructure is severely under-resourced and remain vulnerable due to years of conflict and the post-August 2021 humanitarian crisis. It also means worsening poverty and losing access to basic primary school education. And most important of all, climate change in Afghanistan fuels conflict and national and regional instability because of lack of development and the fact that rural communities become even more vulnerable and prone to exploitation and joining extremist forces and militants in order to provide for the family and put food on the table. Moreover, competition over resources such as water resources can also fuel regional conflict and instability, as the climate crisis is a catalyst to all of this. You might wonder what will happen to Afghanistan if it goes on like this? Well, I have thought about this, and I'm gonna share my thoughts with you. As an activist from the Global South, if nothing is done about the climate crisis in Afghanistan, a very grim and dark future awaits Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, where the climate disasters are happening without breaks, and the governments and aid organizations are busy cleaning up the mess after each disaster. And of course, in such a situation, the sustainable development will not even stand a chance. It will be a future where the rural areas would have lost all their agricultural productivity and their only source of livelihood, and the young people will be recruited in militant groups instead of being enrolled in schools. The youngsters will have no choice but to turn to child labor. Child marriages will be the norm of the day, and Afghanistan will go into a downward spiral of conflict, instability, humanitarian crises, and underdevelopment. However, let's stop right there, because that is not the future I hope for Afghanistan. That is not the future I hope for my homeland. A very hopeful future is also possible for Afghanistan. One that can be made possible with collective action and global responsibility. It is up to we activists, experts, and civil society to speak up, to put pressure on the governments and international community so that they take action for the protection, the basic human rights, and the well-being of Afghans. So, what can be done about the climate crisis in Afghanistan? As an aid-dependent country under sanctions, Afghanistan cannot adapt and mitigate the climate crisis on its own. It cannot function in isolation. The international community and the so-called global north giants should stop politicizing environment and climate change efforts and funding. Afghanistan is a country of hope, richness, resilience, and possibilities. The unfair and unjust sanctions of the Western states not only damage Afghanistan, but it also deprives it of the means and possibilities to progress and to survive the climate crisis. These sanctions, unfortunately, only punish civilians and the general population. The politicization of the environment and climate change projects should not be the way forward, and it cannot be the way forward. The international community has to find a way to continue the climate and environmental projects in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and the catastrophic climate change impacts cannot wait. Besides, grassroots initiatives, local networks, and community-based organizations need to be supported and empowered, because these are the real engine of change when it comes to environment and climate change related development efforts in Afghanistan. In the end, I would like to close the talk with a statement. Let's hope and let's ensure that Afghanistan's voice is heard in the fight against the climate crisis, and that it has the opportunity, resources, funding, and support to not only survive the climate crisis, but also to thrive and to achieve sustainable development. Last but not the least, don't forget Afghanistan. Thank you.